Right, so let's now dive into long-term memory. So I touched on this earlier, but what exactly is the long-term memory? So long-term memory has a limitless or unlimited memory capacity or unlimited capacity storage. Or storage capacity. Unlike working memory, which is limited, the storage capacity for the long-term memory has no real limits. So the long-term memory is a system of memory responsible for storing and retrieving information over an extended period of time, ranging from minutes to hours, days, weeks, months, or even years. It enables us to retain and recall vast amounts of knowledge, experiences, skills, concepts acquired throughout our lives, all of our prior knowledge, all of our past live experiences that we might remember or retain so that we can actively recall it. So it encompasses all things that you can remember. For example, information stored in the long-term memory can last for an extended period of time and for potentially a lifetime. And examples include like driving or riding a bike or drinking boba. These aren't necessarily things that you actively remember how to do, but you know it because it's already encoded into your long term memory. And so while forgetting can occur over time, some memories can be retained for decades or even throughout a person's entire life. So maybe there was a moment when you were a child that you really remember. It was maybe your first time going to Disneyland, or your first time going to school, or maybe it was your first job that you experienced. These are things that you remember because it's already in your long-term memory. So just to kind of situate us now where we are in the information processing model, we are now looking at this area in the teal, the long term memory. And we're going to be thinking about how does information actually get into the long term memory and what kinds of long term memory are there. So how do we get things into the long-term memory? I did talk about actively encoding, actively retrieving, but what exactly is retrieval? So retrieval is this process of accessing and bringing stored memories back into conscious awareness. So these are things that we've experienced in our prior knowledge in our past lives, things that we can remember and recall to then use. It can occur through various cues, such as contextual cues, emotional triggers, or maybe associative links. Successful retrieval depends on the strength and the accessibility of the stored memory traces. So what that means is in order for us to recall or to retrieve that information that is in our memory structures, these schemas that we have that are building blocks that make up our memory, you need to intentionally try to retrieve items from your memory repeatedly in order to make it stick. So information is retrieved from long-term memory through conscious effort and the use of retrieval cues. Retrieval cues can be external stimuli or internal association that trigger the retrieval of specific memories. So oftentimes we might maybe use a flashcard deck, and you have the concept in front and the definition that you need to remember in the back. When we're constantly going through these flashcards and we're like trying to actively remember, okay, what is that definition back there, and then you say it out loud or you mentally say it, and then you constantly repeat these actions, that's the process of intentionally trying to retrieve items that is in your long-term memory. And so that's taking information that we're currently working on, let's say those index cards and those definitions, and then actively trying to encode and then retrieve that information. So then maybe doing this over a span of a week, when we take the exam, we're ready and we know that information in the back of our mind. So the catch is, though, like I mentioned, is that you can't wait too long from when you are actively working on that information or try to solidify it too fast. I gave the example of index cards, but I don't mean to just, the night before the exam, you're just going to go through and make all these index cards. But I mentioned that maybe over a span of a week, spacing out your learning, spacing out the repetition and recall. Researchers suggest that the key is to chunk, associate, and space out the attempts to remember in just the right way. So chunking similar types of concepts together, making associations to those kinds of concepts that maybe group them into a particular category or theme, and then spacing out the attempts and the trials to remember in just the right way. So if you think about how you might want to study for this course in order to take the information that we're working on that's in your working memory and then to actively encode and retrieve that information so that it can then stay in your long-term memory. You can think about the different kinds of modalities that I've given in order for you to encode and practice this information. That's whether that's through the video lectures or those embedded video questions that allow you to actively try and attempt these to answer these kinds of questions. Or maybe you might be using the assignments or the in-module assignments to apply what you're learning. And then maybe you're also using those knowledge check and practice sessions with practice section where in the deck where you're able to use those flashcards or those matching or through practice exam questions. These are all different types of learning modalities that can help reinforce your learning, but also provide that opportunity to actively encode and retrieve. So then to kind of further break down long-term memory, there are two types of long-term memory, which include explicit or declarative, and then implicit or non-declarative. And then within those two scaffolds, there are also 4 different types so 2 types within explicit and 2 types within implicit, which for the explicit side first, these are episodic. So these are experienced events, things that you remember because you personally lived through it, right? Semantic, so these are knowledge and concepts. So these are like facts. So these are like information that you know. So like say I gave you the example of, oh, you took your, math 2A, 2B class and you remember just instinctually how to take a derivative or how to take to conduct an integral, for example, right? These are facts that that have been encoded into your long-term memory. As far as implicit or non-declarative, there is procedural, which includes skills and actions. So these are like driving a car, how to walk, how to ride a scooter. But then there's also emotional conditioning. So these are like reactions in the ways that our bodies might, we might tear up when we see a movie, or we might cry when we're sad. So these kinds of emotional aspects that doesn't necessarily require us to remember how to cry or remember how to feel sad, right? These are things that are in our long-term memory already. So to dive in again a little bit deeper, so explicit is declarative long-term memory involves the conscious and intentional retrieval of facts, events, and knowledge. Implicit or non-declarative are these unconscious or automatic feelings, right? So implicit refers to the unconscious or non-conscious memory processes that influence behavior without requiring conscious effort or awareness. So let's dive into a little bit more examples of explicit or explicit memory that includes episodic and semantic memory first. So some example of things that are remembered through explicit memory include all the items maybe on a shopping list. Let's say you mentally created a shopping list that you remember that you go every single week to the grocery store, or let's say Costco, for example, and you always buy the same exact things. Other things include like birth dates of friends and family members, important events from your life, such as your wedding, maybe a special trip you took with friends, or a notable milestone that you experienced in your life. Other things that include episodic and semantic memory are names and locations of different countries on a map. Maybe you know the capitals of all the states in all the states in America, or maybe you know where different countries are located directly on a map. These are all things that include facts or lived experiences that you've encountered that have been stored and encoded in your long-term memory. Another thing is explicit, right? So let's dive into some examples of explicit memories, which include the procedural memories, which are things like knowing your motor skills, and then things that are learned through emotion or through conditioning, like emotions. So knowing how to use utensils when you eat, or how to dress yourself every day. Also things like navigating a familiar area such as your house or your neighborhood, and recalling how to boil water to fix, some topped ramen, or things like learning how to drive a car. And remembering, maybe even like remembering the words to a popular song after hearing just a few notes. So like one of the things could be like, you hear a Taylor Swift song that goes on, and it's like this song like Love Story or something that you haven't heard for years. And all of a sudden you're like hearing it on the radio, and it's like, oh, you know every single word to that song. All of that information was encoded at some point into your long-term memory. And we are just re- waiting or encountering, we're experiencing things in our life that are serving as retrieval cues that then trigger our memory to allow us to remember that information that's been encoded and then retrieve that information that's in our long term memory structures.